DC. The two sat down at the White House this afternoon for a meeting designed to demonstrate a smooth handover of power. The Reuters news agency is reporting that during the meeting, Biden told Trump he was, quote, looking forward to a peaceful transition, whilst Trump stated that, in his words, politics is tough, but it's a nice world today. Back in the UK, and the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, has criticised Sir Keir Starmer at PMQs today over council tax, national insurance contributions and the budget. The Conservative leader also pressed the PM on decisions he made at the COP29 climate summit in Baku.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the Prime Minister back from his trip to Azerbaijan, where he has unilaterally made commitments that will make life more experienced for everyone back home.
I'm very proud of the fact that we're restoring leadership on climate to this country, to the UK, because that will be measured in lower bills on energy independence and the jobs of the future. And in relation, and she may have missed, but on Monday I was very pleased to announce a huge order into jobs in Hull for blades for offshore wind. If she's opposed to that sort of action, she should go to Hull and say so.
And never mind the age-old question of a white Christmas, could we be in for a white November? The Met Office has announced that the UK could see a flurry of snow as early as this Sunday, as temperatures have already plummeted below zero in certain parts of the country. They say that Arctic winds moving southward will bring freezing weather, bringing with it what they called the possibility of snow. Well, as the song goes, let it snow. But for now, those are your latest GB News headlines. I'm Sophie Reaper. More from me in the next hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Welcome back to State of the Nation. It was not that long ago when, just after the general election campaign, Sir Keir Starmer boldly told the electorate that the Labour government would tread more lightly on people's lives.
You have given us a clear mandate, and we will use it to deliver change, to restore service and respect to politics, end the era of noisy performance, tread more lightly on your lives, and unite our country.
I don't suppose many people particularly believed it at the time, especially considering this was the man who wanted the Marxist Jeremy Corbyn to become Prime Minister. But he reaffirmed the sentiment yesterday at COP29 after announcing the pledge to cut UK greenhouse gas emissions by 81% by 2035.
What we're not going to do is start telling people how to live their lives. We're not going to start dictating to people what they do. It is an ambitious target, it's a realisable target, but it's not going to be one in which we tell people how to live their lives.
It was surely only a matter of time before the veracity of such a statement came under strain. It turns out that the reduced emissions pledge comes straight from the Climate Change Committee, an institution that was initially set up by the Labour Party, and within that policy proposal is the assumption that this goal could only be met by people reducing meat and dairy consumption as well as travel. So much for not telling people how to live their lives. But the same applies elsewhere. The National Energy System Operator issued new advice last week which claimed that consumers will have to be flexible with their energy demands, echoing what Ofgem had said a few months earlier. Requiring flexible energy demands of consumers is Orwellian newspeak for energy rationing. Not only does this undermine the nature of our energy system to ensure supply meets demand, and not only is this disastrous for our already failing industry, which requires regular energy flow, but it contradicts what the Prime Minister said about not telling people what to do. The government imposes penalties onto car manufacturers if they don't sell enough electric cars. Indeed, it's planning to ban new petrol and diesel cars by 2035. Surely this constitutes telling people what to do. And what, of course, of the government's war on boilers? In 2035, new gas and oil boiler installations will be banned too, forcing consumers to pay for the more costly and less efficient heat pumps. Sir Keir says one thing and he means another. He says government of service, but he means service to himself, paid for by Lord Alley. He says he won't tax working people, but he means he will tax working people by hiking employer national insurance. And he says he won't tell people what to do, and then he tells them how to lead their lives. As ever, let me know your views, mailmog@gbnews.com. But I'm joined now by a great friend of the programme, Climate Media Coalition Director, Donica McCarthy. Donica, thank you very much for coming in, as always. When you're saying that people are going to have to reduce their dairy and meat consumption, and I've seen reports by as much as 50% to meet this 81% target, you're clearly going to be telling people how to lead their lives.
Well, there's nothing in your package there that wasn't happening under the Tory government.
I agree with that.
So actually blaming Keir Starmer for...
Well, he's now the Prime
proposals.
Minister. He's in charge and he's confirmed it at the international level. He could have run away from it. He could have said, I'm not going to do this.
So we've got thankfully, we had a consensus between the Tory government and the Labour government that actually we need to act on climate. And one of the things that I think about Keir Starmer's speech today was actually he was referring to the benefit for the British economy. Now, we have actually, as you know, we've discussed many times, is we've cut our carbon emissions by 50% already. What Keir Starmer is saying is that we need to cut it by 31% further in 11 years. Or 10 years. That is not beyond the bounds of reason to do.
It's quite hard to do because it's not 31% from where we now are. It is 31% from where we were in 1990. So having cut by 50%, you're basically talking about a 60% cut from where we now are. That's very significant.
So it's like, for example, the national grid. We went from almost 100% fossil fuels to now only 28%.
Hold on, you say that, but in the last couple...
only another 28% That's amazing achievement by the British
last couple of
economy.
weeks, when there hasn't been much sunshine, there hasn't been much wind, fossil fuels have been providing over 55% of generation. So it's not 28%. That's when everything's going well.
Over the year.
Yeah.
Over a year. Well, I mean, you have to look at the total. 38% of our electricity came from renewables last year. 28% from fossil fuels.
That's not actually that useful a figure, because the key to the use of fossil fuels is that you need electricity when you need it. You can't generate electricity in July and use it in December.
Well, you can.
And therefore, you need... The battery technology isn't there.
We've talked about hydrogen, green hydrogen.
But we aren't there. We're miles from green hydrogen being there.
And I'm actually answering, yes, it is possible if we build it.
Well, it's not something we're currently able to do.
We've got a decade to build it.
You're going from a situation where when we don't have wind and we don't have sunshine, we need an enormous amount of gas. Our gas stations are ageing and we're not renewing them. We're going to find we are short of energy, which is why they're talking about rationing.
No, they're not talking about rationing.
Yes, they are. They just use this ridiculous...
Flexibility. So what does that mean?
What do they call it?
It's called flexibility.
Flexibility. Flexible energy demands.
Yeah.
That means that the price spikes when you want to use it.
Actually, how it's meant so far is that the consumer is paid to actually adjust when they use their energy. They're not actually saying reduce the amount of energy.
You are penalising people for using energy. No, you're not. You're penalising. Somebody has to pay for that. And other consumers pay for it. And what we've done previously with our electricity supply is to make demand and supply match by ensuring there's sufficient supply at every hour of the day, every minute, every second of the day and the night. Now we're saying, as it's difficult to produce because we're reducing the flexibility that hydrocarbons give us, we'd rather you didn't use it.
No, what I understand is happening, and it is what is happening, is that we're actually saying to consumers, if you wish to have your washing machine at 10 o'clock in the evening rather than 9 o'clock, we'll pay you. And so what that means is saves Britain the huge capital cost of replacing some of those aging gas power plants and coal plants. So
actually,
from an efficiency point of view,
if we were sticking to gas and using our own gas resources and fracking, we would be able to supply people with cheap energy when they wanted it.
Cheap but destructive. Cheap energy now, but what are the costs on homeowners? Climate change is already costing homeowners through food inflation and household insurance inflation.
It's not.
ECIU have figures clearly showing
food inflation has come about not because of climate change. We've had food inflation in the last few years, post Ukraine because of the rise of the cost of fertiliser.
We have, that's true.
We've had over decades a decline in the price of food, and actually slightly warmer temperatures increase
in the last few years,
the productivity.
In the last few years, with respect, Jacob, you're right. We'd have food inflation for two reasons. One was because of the spike in oil and fertiliser prices because of that. But secondly, because major food producers such as Spain, Russia, America have been hit with extreme weather. That has impacted the food price globally. UK farmers lost 20% of their crops last year. It impacts them directly.
We've had those sorts of weather events throughout our history, and actually, the weather events are less extreme now than they were in the 1990s. They've had a lower effect in terms of GDP destruction than they had in the 1990s. So we're actually better off. In which case, if this is all the fault of climate change, let's have more of it, because it's clearly helping us.
That's, I think, abusing the figures in a way, because what you're actually saying is we have invested to protect ourselves from extreme weather. What we haven't been able to do is protect ourselves from extreme weather damaging our crops, and that's where it's... yes, I'm agreeing with you. We always had extreme weather, but it's very clear science. Every degree warmer, Jacob, takes 7% extra water in the atmosphere. We've had 2 degrees rise in temperature. We have now 15% more water in the atmosphere.
Warmer weather makes our crops more productive. And more productive crops lowers the cost.
A flooded crop produces nothing.
We've got to finish. But thank you as always for coming in. After the break, I'll be discussing the death of democracy as we know it with the former leader of the Conservative Party, Michael Howard.
Sunday with Michael Portillo from 11, only on GB News.
Welcome back to Sunday with Michael Portillo. Well, drinkers have been warned about a drop in the quality of French wines after poor weather conditions hit this year's grape harvest. Winemakers across France will make 240 million fewer bottles of wine this year, the country's farming ministry said on Tuesday. So should we think of switching from French to English? I'm joined now by sommelier and founder of Inflorescence Wines, Jacinta Madison-Williams. Hello, Jacinta.
Good morning.
Nice to see you. First of all, let's just think about the poor French.
We should.
Has this been a fairly universal weather catastrophe for France?
It has. A kind of across the board, we're about 22% down on last year's crops, which is quite significant. I think it's like one of the 4 years over the last century that have been this low. So,
and it's affected both quality and quantity?
I would say more so quantity. There's always ways of counteracting quality. It depends if people are desperate to make wine. They can obviously push out more watered down grapes. There's been a lot of rain, if you hadn't noticed. Not only in France, we felt it here too. But lots of frost, supercell hailstorms have completely wiped out some crops. So in some cases, there's nothing to make. In other cases, it's just really watered down grapes and you want to pick earlier to make sure you're avoiding all those rains. But I would say more so it's quantity. But saying that, France is still the biggest producer of wine in the world. It might be taken over by Spain this year, but as a consumer, don't panic. We're not going to run out of wine. And we obviously have lots of lovely wine growing here now in England. So whether we do make a little jump for a bit to English wine, but there's definitely still lots out there.
GB News, the People's Channel.
This is Britain's Newsroom, where your voice matters.
It's just astonishing. With expert analysis and honest opinion, we don't just keep you informed.
We bring you unique perspectives you won't see anywhere else.
Can't argue with any of that. When the news happens, it happens here.
On Britain's Newsroom, weekdays from 9:30 a.m.
Only on GB News.
If you want your news to be straight talking...
This is the nightmare for the Conservatives again.
Down to earth.
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
And most importantly, honest.
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them.
Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akwe, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
No, he didn't say that, though.
I'm so surprised.
I think there's an element of truth to that.
Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and we were talking about COP29 and the mail mogs have come in. Michael says, I'm forecasting that as the national grid and distribution networks, together with a lack of generation capacity, gets worse under net zero, our electricity consumption will be controlled through our smart meters, not by switching off, but by having very expensive tariffs. If we increase our consumption and exceed demand at designated times. Yes, I think that's the obvious use of smart meters, Michael. I think you're right. And Alan says, Starmer's climate change ideology is driving the country to poverty. He lives in a world of make-believe. November, and people are already using blankets to keep warm. The United Kingdom is among the most democratic countries in the world. In our system of parliamentary sovereignty and unwritten constitution, governments both have mandates to govern and may be held to account. But this changed under Tony Blair. The new Labour era introduced the quangocracy, non-democratically accountable institutions that were granted powers taken from politicians. This phenomenon is perhaps best embodied by the Human Rights Act, which has granted more power than ever to the courts, allowing them effectively to override Parliament. One man who tried valiantly to warn the country of this creeping constitutional change is the former leader of the Conservative Party and Home Secretary, Michael the Lord Howard, who joins me now. Michael, thank you very much for coming in. You've done the foreword to this report.
Yes.
Setting out some of the problems of the Human Rights Act. What do you think the fundamental difficulty with it is?
The fundamental difficulty is that it draws our judges into an area where they have to judge competing rights and interests. And that ought essentially to be the job of elected politicians who are accountable for the decisions that they make. It's essentially a political decision, and judges are not accountable. Indeed, they are the product largely of a kind of self-appointed oligarchy. Now, they have an important role in our system, and I'm not arguing against judicial review, but the Human Rights Act introduced a completely new element into their role, and I think it's been very damaging.
And it gives them the power to read words in Acts of Parliament that aren't in their normal meaning, but are in a meaning that you could give to them. So they're given a very extensive interpretive power, which isn't necessarily what Parliament means.
Yes, they've always had an interpretive power, to be fair, but they now have, and it's Parliament's fault in a way, because Parliament enacted the Human Rights Act. So Parliament gave the judges this power, which was a great mistake, as the policy exchange paper makes clear. The problem is that they are now, by that act, instructed to interpret acts of Parliament in accordance with the European Convention on Human Rights, even if that leads to a very strained interpretation and a distortion of what Parliament intended.
And it's done some very odd things. And one of the cases that is highlighted is on parole, where the courts decided to change Parliament's view that you should only be released if you were not dangerous, to you should not be released if you could be shown to be dangerous, which is a really fundamental change in the meaning of an Act of Parliament.
It is, and you can have different views on the substance of the question, but it is an issue which ought to be decided by accountable elected politicians. That's how our democracy ought to work.
So how would you bring human rights into our system? Would you pull out of the European Convention, or do you think that remains a useful safeguard for human rights in the UK?
I wouldn't rule out withdrawing from the Convention, but I think it should be a last resort and not a first resort. I would deal with the Human Rights Act, and I would make that a priority. And then I'd wait and see how the Court of Human Rights behaved. After all, many of the problems which we face, which we've run into difficulty over and under the Convention, are now being faced by other European countries. And remember that enforcement of the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights lies with the Council of Europe, which consists of representatives of the governments of Europe, not the European Union, but wider Europe. So I would deal with the Human Rights Act, and then I'd wait and see, and hope that the European Court of Human Rights would take sensible decisions in the light of the real challenges that European countries face. In extremis, if they attempted to thwart on an important issue the view of the elected parliament of our country, I would be prepared to withdraw. but I would adopt a pragmatic rather than a dogmatic view to that question.
And the difference is that with the Human Rights Act, our courts are put in a separate relationship to Parliament, whereas with the European Court of Human Rights, its judgments actually have to be brought into UK law. So there is an opportunity, as there was with prisoner voting rights, for Parliament to say, well, actually, we don't agree with that. And if the Council of Europe is happy, and if it's not happy, it takes years anyway to indicate its discontent, the main principle of parliamentary sovereignty is maintained.
That's exactly right. And in fact, the trouble is that our judges, the Act doesn't actually require them to follow decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. It requires them to take those decisions into account. But for far too long, they have followed those decisions rather slavishly and sometimes gone beyond them.
And this is one of the difficulties, because we're a common law system and therefore precedent is very important.
Indeed.
The European Court is not a common law court, it's a civil code court, and therefore its judgments don't theoretically have precedential value until they're interpreted by our courts, which just seems a very complicated way of going about things.
Yes, it is. I mean, I don't think that's perhaps the most heinous consequence of the Human Rights Act, but it's part of the whole tapestry which that Act introduced and which I think has been damaging.
And the issues you get are a question of balance, aren't they? That's the issue where it ought to be decided by politicians, that you're not talking about the absolutes. Parliament isn't going to pass an act saying that torture is legal in this country. Parliament is not going to do completely outrageous things, and if it did, the government that did it would be voted out, which is the great safeguard.
Yeah.
But I'm fascinated by how privacy law has developed in this country without Parliament ever passing it, and that this has had an effect on freedom of speech, that freedom of speech is now balanced by the courts against privacy. The authority for that seems to me to be very vague.
Yes, of course, ultimately, Parliament does have the ability to intervene and to say the courts are getting this wrong, and this is what the law should be, and this is what we're going to enact. So Parliament does have that reserve power, but of course Parliament has many things to consider, and those things don't always achieve the priority which they perhaps should.
And if you were to repeal the Human Rights Act, would you replace it with a British Bill of Rights? Does that become the answer, the quid pro quo, really, to say, well, look, we're domesticating it, we're having our own rights, we're not taking other people's rights?
I think that's a bit of a blind alley. I don't think we need a code of human rights. We have a parliamentary democracy. We should treasure our parliamentary democracy. That is our safeguard, and our safeguard is the fact that it is a democracy. And if our elected politicians act in a way which the public don't like, they can and are kicked out.
Yes. The only thing I don't quite see where you fit the European Convention into this. Is it a nice-to-have thing which Parliament can ignore, or to what extent do you think we are bound by international law, treaty obligations in domestic law?
Well, we are, until we withdraw from the Convention. We are bound to adhere to the Convention and to adhere to the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. And other things being equal, bearing in mind that the only countries so far, I think I'm right in saying, to have withdrawn from the Convention were Greece under the Colonels and Russia, that's not necessarily a company we'd like to keep. So, as I say, I don't rule withdrawal out, but I would see it as a last resort rather than as a first resort. Let's see how, once we've dealt with the Human Rights Act, the European Court of Human Rights behaves.
And would you be willing to derogate from European Court of Human Rights decisions in the interim if they were ones that went against government policy? I'm obviously thinking of the effective injunction about Rwanda.
Well, to the extent that you can. But you see, the decision that really put an end to the Rwanda scheme was not a decision of the European Court of Human Rights. It was a decision of our courts. And it illustrates very clearly the difference between traditional judicial review and the Human Rights Act. In that case, the Divisional Court and the Lord Chief Justice then, in the Court of Appeal, took the traditional view of judicial review and said the government was entitled to decide that Rwanda was a safe country. The Supreme Court, following slavishly a decision of the European Court of Human Rights, said it's for us to decide whether Rwanda is a safe country, not the government. We are not going to look at the government's decision on the basis of whether it was reasonable or not. We are going to decide it for ourselves. And that, I think, is completely alien to the role of the courts in our country.
And the judges stand for Parliament if that's what they want to do.
Precisely.
Michael, thank you so much for coming in. Well, I think Lord Howard is the most distinguished guest we've had on State of the Nation to date, so I'm very grateful he came in. After the break, the United States' new head of government efficiency, Elon Musk's new plans for the federal budget put my old plans in the Cabinet Office to shame. Find out why in a moment.
Evening. Thanks for joining me for your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. A lot of cloud around tomorrow. For many, it'll be a duller day compared to today. But again, for most places, not going to be much rain around. It has been a very dry start to November, thanks to high pressure by and large. Changes are on the way, particularly as we go towards the weekend. There is a weather front just slowly working south, but it's kind of fizzling out, bumping up against that high pressure. Will still bring some rain and drizzle, just trickling its way south across parts of central and eastern England through the night, eventually turning things a bit damp across the southeast. Ahead of it, temperatures could dip down to single figures, but behind it with a lot more cloud, generally a milder night than last night. Could again be some mist and fog patches forming through parts of southern Scotland where we do get the clearer spells, and it will be a damp and potentially drizzly start to the day across southernmost counties of England, so a very different feel here compared to today. Elsewhere, most places just dry and cloudy, but there will be some holes in the cloud here and there. Thick cloud, though, for northern Scotland means a dull and damp and at times drizzly morning for the Highlands and the Western Isles. Let's go through the rest of the day. Not a great deal will change. I'm hopeful the rain and drizzle in the far south should scoot away, and also that skies will brighten over central and eastern England in particular. Decent chance of seeing some sunny spells coming through. Parts of southern and eastern Scotland may also brighten up, but for many it will just stay pretty drab. Where it does, 10 or 11 the top temperature, bit of brightness, could see those temperatures getting up into the teens, and again the wind's fairly light for most places. Friday we'll start to see a change, but again for most it'll be dry. Some light rain and drizzle over northern England, North Wales, turning wetter in the far northwest and windier here as well. This is an active weather front that's going to bring a change, getting gusty and turning soggy. Further south, generally dry with some sunshine, 10 or 11 degrees Celsius, but it's going to turn colder for all of us through the weekend.
Mark Dolan tonight is your weekend dose of news, debate and entertainment.
This sounds like a wild conspiracy theory.
Don't miss My Big Opinion, Mark Meets, and My Take at 10.
Democracy is a funny old thing.
And we don't do boring, not on my watch. I just won't have it.
Let's go and get another glass of that bubbly. You've earned it.
That's Mark Dolan tonight, Saturday and Sunday, 9 to 11, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, for a frank and honest discussion with those in power that cuts through the spin and gets to the heart of the issues shaping our nation.
You haven't confirmed that you want to stand as leader, but you haven't ruled it out either.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial. Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
I deliver the dose of reality Westminster needs.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Well, we were talking about human rights, and your mail mogs have come in. Andrew says, you're both right on what Blair did. Politicians now merely take responsibility for decisions made for bureaucrats. Why bother voting at this point? And Jeff says, very good to see Lord Howard on the show, Jacob. I remember hoping he'd become Prime Minister years ago. Yes, so do I. It would have been much better than the 2005 re-election of Tony Blair. Anyway, as Minister of Government Efficiency, I wanted to cut civil service numbers by 100,000 back to pre-2016 levels. It was a proposal criticised at the time for being too radical and unrealistic. However, America's new head of the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, Elon Musk, has new plans that put mine to shame. The Tesla and Twitter owner has plans to cut $2 trillion from the federal budget in what has been dubbed Muskonomics. But can he pull it off? Well, I'm joined now by Raj Goyal, a personal friend of Kamala Harris and former Kansas State Representative. Thank you so much for coming back on the programme, Raj. Can the federal government be cut by a third?
I think this is, it's interesting when you call them a minister. I know that's a phraseology over there across the pond. This is not a commission that's inside the government. This is actually, and I think most people in the Beltway don't even understand the double entendre on DOGE, which is of course his token. So I really think, look, there's a real critical issue of government waste and inefficiency, and we as Democrats, who we are all licking our wounds after this week, and I'm certainly in the wing of the Democratic Party that thinks we need very structural reform and we need to embrace an innovation agenda. But to be clear, the richest man in the world with billions of dollars of personal wealth wrapped up in government contracts with this quasi-commission where he's hanging out in Mar-a-Lago eating cheeseburgers with Donald Trump, and now Vivek, the two of them have never spent 1 second in government. I would just say I wouldn't hold your breath that there's going to be much government cutting from these two. And the last thing I'll say is the Republican administrations have been absolute catastrophes at slowing the growth of government. They have only radically expanded it. So the data would show that I don't think you should be holding out too great hope here.
OK, but when he took over Twitter and then renamed it X, he just fired people right, left and centre, didn't he? He saw something that had become flabby because it found it too easy to raise cash. It was able to pay people lots of money, employ people doing lots of unnecessary jobs. And he just cut not only the fat, but he cut everything he could out of it. Can that be done within the federal government?
Well, I'm a tech CEO. Let me ask you a question. Do you think the investors in X are happy? He bought that for $44 billion. What do you think the market capitalization of X, even though it was a take private, what do you think it is now? So slashing jobs is great. And by the way, I am all for cutting flab. I had an efficiency software in the legal space. I hate inefficiency in the public realm and in the private realm. But let's also not kid ourselves about what exactly is going to happen here. And of course, we have to have a fundamental question about the role of government. And so, I remember back in a previous Republican presidential debate, they were mocking the hurricane agency, that does catastrophic weather prediction and mitigation in America. Do we think that's government waste? So, of course, is there excess? If there's excess, it should be cut. But I don't think your example of coming into San Francisco and moving a company that's a software company to Austin, I don't think X is performing that well, and it's certainly taken a beating as a company in the private sector. So, ask the investors who invested in Elon if they're happy with what he's done at X.
And how would you cut waste in government? Where do you see it as being? Is it in entitlements? Is it in programs? Is it in the number of employees? Is it in procurement? Where do you think the worst excesses are?
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, look, I spent a lot of time in the procurement space, and I do think that when we think about, there's a famous line from former Governor Mario Cuomo who said, the Pentagon, and at the time he was criticizing Ronald Reagan. He said he was spending money on a missile system we couldn't even afford to use. So I do think that there is great bloat. It was President Eisenhower, of course, in the 50s, who warned about the military-industrial complex. And so we've got this interesting realignment where there's a scramble between right and left about where, traditionally Democrats were very critical of the Pentagon budget and the fact that there's opaqueness around that budget. Now it seems like Trump is sort of taken that mantle. So yes, of course, in procurement, and where, there's that old saying, at least in American politics, that sunlight is the best disinfectant. It comes from Justice Louis Brandeis. And so I do believe that there is important transparency to have in budgeting, not just at the federal level, but in state and local levels as well. Where it comes from, of course, there is a philosophical debate to have around entitlements. And so if you think of entitlements in a limited way where a social safety net is limited, of course you're going to want to cut those. But there's also a great appetite for the fact that Franklin Roosevelt moved more people out of poverty than anyone since Abraham Lincoln, because senior citizens were dying and they were hungry here. And then we put in a federal pension system. So these are the kind of debates we need to have. But again, I don't think Elon Musk is prepared to have that kind of debate, and he's going to have a rude awakening when he enters the world of politics as opposed to the private sector, where you have to balance competing interests.
That's absolutely true. Businessmen often find the transition into politics extremely difficult. Anyway, thank you very much, Raj. Always a pleasure to have you on the programme. And I'm joined now by my most formidable panel, the former Conservative Cabinet Minister, Sir John Redwood, and the historian and broadcaster, Tessa Dunlop. John, it would be amazing if the US federal government could be cut by a third. But do you agree with Raj that it's not actually realistic?
I think you've got to proceed at a pace that is acceptable. I mean, I would do it primarily by not recruiting. You get 7 or 8% natural turnover in staff, so the friendly way of doing it is to not replace people from outside and then give greater promotion prospects to the ones that are still there. There are some times when you want to get rid of a whole function or a whole activity, and then it's best to transfer those to the private sector if there are people involved. And this government, for example, shouldn't waste $19.5 billion on carbon capture and storage. We don't need to add that new pointless exercise to our overall costs, so we simply shouldn't be doing it. In the United Kingdom, I would start with the massive losses of the really bad nationalised industries, and the huge losses and delays and overruns of HS2 are completely unacceptable. And if somebody is paid hundreds of thousands of pounds to get that wrong, they shouldn't be. They shouldn't be earning bonuses, and they should indeed be replaced. And we see the same with the post office, with an absolute disgraceful meltdown, huge losses, bad business model, as well as doing wrong by the staff.
But isn't the difficulty with all of that is that you've got, in this country, and of course in the US in a different form, you've got health and welfare, which take vast amounts of the budget. And as Labour has found with cutting the winter fuel allowance, any cut is incredibly politically difficult and unpopular.
Yeah, well, that was particularly stupid one because it's so little money and it annoys so many people. No, you're right. But, I mean, you were right to want to take down the size of the civil service. It's 33% higher than 2016. Its productivity is
lower. It's disgraceful.
And it has appointed a lot of people to higher positions so they don't do so much useful work and they get paid a lot more. And that has got to be dealt with and tackled vigorously. And I'm pleased to see that Wes Streeting is saying that the money which they are going to commit in addition to the health service does have to be linked to changes. I don't know whether he's got the right mix, but I wish him well. At least he's recognising that there is a massive bad management problem in NHS.
I'm so relieved that John picked up on Wes Streeting. I'm surprised you didn't lead with it. His sort of kick-ass, clean-up-your-act NHS, the idea that a poor manager won't be given a pay rise in the NHS. I thought this would have been music to your ears.
I think it's very encouraging. I think Wes Streeting may be able to reform the NHS. My concern is that they've given it money before the reforms, and the previous experience is that if you give money first and reform second, the money gets spent before the reforms happen.
Arguably, they gave money to the foot soldiers, to the nurses, to those working on the front line, to those who most needed it. And actually, he was focused on the managers.
No, just giving the budget a huge amount of extra money to the NHS. That's above and beyond the pay rises that have been given. And so, yes, absolutely, fire bad managers. But people have been talking about that for an awful long time. It seems a very difficult thing to do within the state sector. But to go back to Elon Musk, I mean, what is being proposed is enormous. If a third of the federal budget could be removed.
A lot of this is sort of newcomer chutzpah, isn't it? Trump making a big splash, making sure that every morning the left have got a bucket and something to vomit up before they get on with their day. I mean, Trump said himself, you know, Musk's a busy guy. He spends a lot of time firing rockets into the sky. You know, this is, I think, probably a bit of tokenism, symbolic. If it isn't, then it's sincerely worrying, by the way.
I just wonder whether it's a realisation that Western governments need radical transformation and that all we've been talking about is fiddling at the edges. And actually there's a real problem. The US has an enormous deficit, its debt is running out of control, and economic growth is affected by having governments that are too big. And it's no longer just about paring off a little bit here and there. It's about fundamental transformation of what the state does and how much it costs.
And we think that someone like Elon Musk is going to understand how to balance public sector interests. This is a guy who went in to the Twitter emporium that you alluded to, that he'd just bought. He fired 6,000 people, and incidentally, because neither of you seem to know, he wiped 80% off its share value overnight, and it continues to underperform. So it's not like he's untouchable. Yes, he's had many successful business models, but that's very different. Well, you know that you also have to protect the public sector, the arts, health. There's all sorts of competing interests that don't deliver bang for your buck.
The final thing I'd say about his success as businessman is he's been incredibly into the detail of looking at every aspect of process, and that has managed to take costs out. He's been very good at that, and that's been his sort of unique selling point, his USP.
In terms of his position in a democracy, it's worrying. I would be very worried because it's outside of federal law.
But I think a business person who is prepared to listen to the system can get further than some of the politicians, and because the businessman knows where the cost is too much and what people can achieve.
All right, well, we're going to have to move on. Thank you to my panel. After the messages, we'll be reflecting on Nigel Farage's revelation of the full extent of Allison Pearson's treatment by the Rozzers for the non-crime of saying the wrong thing on Twitter.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is GB News, Britain's news channel.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
What about train Wi-Fi? The Times. It's so funny the Times did this story because I was on the train yesterday trying to do some work and connecting to the Wi-Fi, and it happens all the time. It just doesn't work. It's pathetic. And then I opened the Times and they've done a massive investigation. Loads of different rail routes from north to south.
Was that the James Bond thing, right?
Yes. Yeah. What's
I think, well, that passenger got through, well, almost got through one episode of one James Bond movie in 8 hours.
But you know, it's interesting. We call it train Wi-Fi, but it isn't. It's just really a SIM card on a train, really. So if your own phone's not going to get signal, why would we assume that the train's going to have signal? It just doesn't work like that. Unless you're in Japan or South Korea, whose infrastructure is infinitely better than ours, you're just not going to get signal. You have to download those films way before you get on
There is technology that can help with that. You know, there really is. If they found ways to put it underground, they can get it on ground and get you going. I definitely think, you know, with the price that we're paying for these tickets, they can get the Wi-Fi going. There is technology.
That's why it's so frustrating, isn't
Call
it?
Elon, get a Starlink. Let's go.
If you're a passenger paying hundreds of pounds for a season ticket or whatever you call it, and you know commute to work every single day, and you're paying all this money, and you can't.
It's so expensive. You'd expect Wi-Fi at the basic. Yeah, exactly.
But it happens with phone signal as well. I'll be walking down London in Park Lane or somewhere else, or down on the south coast. I just don't have phone signal, and I think to myself, what on earth is going on?
Doesn't it feel like 5G's made it worse, though?
Yeah.
Because I feel like 4G, that didn't happen so much, but 5G just feels like...
Yeah, and then I always get this little E in the top corner of my phone, and I don't get any signal. I think it's got worse over the past couple of years. Yeah, especially with 5G. I agree with that.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Join me, Nana Akweer, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
No, he didn't say that, Dave.
I'm so surprised.
I think there's an element of truth to that.
Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Weekdays on GB News. Wake up to breakfast every day from 6 a.m. Followed by Britain's newsroom at 9:30. At noon, it's Good Afternoon Britain. Followed by Martin Daubney from 3 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK,
we're ready to keep you up to date with what's happening every half an hour, every single day. Bulletins here on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. We were talking about DOGE, and I must confess I really did think this was a pun on the Doge of Venice and that type of ruler rather than on a cryptocurrency. But the mail mogs have come in. Alexandra says, Jacob, what stopped you from cutting the 100,000 civil servant jobs when you were in government? Well, we had a plan to do it. We were beginning with the Cabinet Office. We were getting collective agreement. And then people foolishly got rid of Boris Johnson. The government changed. Then it changed again. We had 2 more people in the role I was doing, and it just disappeared. It was a great lost opportunity, but the plan was all there when I was in post. Anyway, Sebastian, why did we never see you and Sir John Redwood in government do your own efficiency commission like Mr Musk? Well, that would have been a great joy. I think we could have got a lot done together.
Yeah.
So, one of the nation's most popular newspaper columnists, and it has to be said, my wife's favourite podcaster, along with Liam Halligan, the Telegraph's very own Allison Pearson, has spoken to GB News on Nigel Farage's programme a bit earlier, revealing the full extent of her mistreatment by the Essex police.
It was shocking. It was upsetting. I'm a law-abiding person. Nobody likes to... I respect the police. I want to trust and respect the police. This seemed to me a completely mad overreaction. Whatever it was that I posted a year ago on X, I'm not in the habit of writing anything horrible and inflammatory. If I wrote something that was unwise, and I appear to have deleted that tweet, I have no memory of what it was. I still don't think that's a proportionate response.
Well, my panel's still with me, former Conservative Cabinet Minister Sir John Redwood and the historian and broadcaster Tessa Dunlop. Tessa, isn't it fundamentally unreasonable for the police to come and see you and say, we think you've tweeted something, we won't tell you what it is, and we won't tell you who your accuser is?
Well, I find it unusual that the police didn't inform her what the tweet said. What I don't find surprising is that it was something she wrote on Twitter and it wasn't something that she'd written on her main platform, The Telegraph, because, of course, The Telegraph is subjected to certain media rules and regulations and belongs to the old rules-based world. And Twitter is a sewer. And I happened to be on the ground in the centre of London on Remembrance Day last year, and it was a pretty febrile atmosphere. And that, by the way, was triggered by communications that were flying around on WhatsApp and on Twitter. And Alison may think that what she tweets isn't extreme, but put it like this, I don't follow her.
No, but isn't freedom of speech fundamentally important? And Alison wrote in her piece in the Telegraph today about the lady who mistakenly tweeted about somebody being an illegal immigrant and was held for 36 hours just for making a mistake. Nothing criminal, but the police seem to overreact in opposition to freedom of speech. And freedom of speech should have a very high level of protection in our system.
Yeah, I often find the police overreact whenever I'm accosted by police. Occasionally, I know it's hard to believe.
Are you accosted by the
occasionally.
Well,
yes.
good heavens. I never knew Tessa led this life of crime. John,
I didn't.
As an upstanding citizen who doesn't get accosted by the police, doesn't free speech deserve an enormous amount of protection? And
yes.
The barrier for acting on something that somebody said should be very high.
Yes, I want to live in a democracy. People have a right to different views. They can express them strongly, but of course there have to be limits. They mustn't encourage hate and incite violence. And
but that's precisely
racism.
What they're doing on these mediums.
Well, we don't know that. And what's so awful about this is that, of course, you have a right to know what you're alleged to have said or what you did actually produce if you can't recall it. And I think you should know who's complaining about it, because that may be relevant to the inquiry. But I suspect, Jacob, a lot of this is down to the Home Secretary and Mr Starmer. I mean, I think they have made it very clear that they wanted a different type of reaction to certain events that took place quite soon after they took over. And so I think the police are following this, and I think it's giving the police a bad name because they're loyally following the government policy.
And non-crime hate speech, if it's not a crime, surely you ought to be free to say it,
yes,
even
nothing
if
to do
it's
with the police. And then the rest of us can say that's dreadful or we don't like it or whatever. That's what free speech is all about.
Let's clarify this. Two things. One is the timeline. This tweet was deleted before Keir Starmer took office. You know how slowly the police operate.
Yeah, but this is now. This is after he took office and after he and the Home Secretary said there had to be special treatment for certain types of crime, and a lot of it was about thought crime.
Okay, I bet you that this has been chugging along in an inbox and has only just now popped up to the surface.
But then the police, you're accusing them of sheer incompetence.
Well,
They've taken a year to look into a small tweet.
I think we know they're overworked. They've got huge backlogs. And yes, sometimes they are, believe it or not, incompetent. But just on the non-hate...
Are they overworked if they're doing completely stupid things like this?
The problem is, if you will recall the level of policing that was required on the streets for last year's Remembrance Day, one of the reasons was, and why you're not focusing on this as opposed to a tweet and Alison Pearson's sensibilities, I don't know, was the deep fake of Sadiq Khan, our London mayor, where a video of him saying, I don't care about Remembrance Day, all I care about is Gaza, and that was dropping into very pumped young men who felt they had to protect the state and were charging at the cenotaph and required huge amounts of policing. So that is where the danger lies. So yes, we do need police to look at what's flying around on the internet.
If they're chasing after Alison Pearson, they're not dealing with serious crime.
No, but the point is it starts on the internet, Jacob. We live in a whole
But it doesn't all start on the internet.
Huge amounts of it on the sewer that is the internet.
Jacob is exactly right. The public have different priorities from the government, and this is a problem for the police, because we don't have enough police, and so they have to make choices. I can quite understand why they follow this idea that certain types of thought crime are unacceptable, whereas other types of thought crime aren't. But we do want more direct engagement in crimes of violence and robbery and the things that really do disturb
Given
people
we're all
a great deal.
groping in the dark, because none of us know what the tweet said, to clarify what is a non-crime hate incident as dictated by Suella Braverman before she left office. This has not been meddled with, i.e. by the current Home Secretary. It is if the incident is, and I quote, clearly motivated by intentional hostility or where there is a, quote, real risk of escalation causing significant harm or criminal.
Well, it seems inconceivable that Alison would have done that. That's why it's so ridiculous.
Why? Because she's a blonde woman who was wearing her slippers when the police knocked on the door.
Because she's a professional woman who writes to earn her living.
And the point is she wasn't on her professional platform. She was on
but
Twitter.
she's still a professional person, and
She
Twitter
deleted the
becomes
tweet.
an extension.
She doesn't want to lose her reputation. Reputation matters a lot.
We've got to finish on this happy note, so thank you to my panel. Up next is Ben Leo in for Patrick Christie's. Ben, what is on your bill of fare this evening?
Good evening, Jacob. Fascinating debate. Great TV. Look, bombshell news breaking this evening. Donald Trump apparently is set to veto David Lammy and Sir Keir Starmer's Chagos Islands deal because, reportedly, Nigel Farage has been piling pressure behind the scenes. So, will we be getting the Chagos Islands back, or at least keeping control of it? Elsewhere, Boots has a new Christmas commercial out. It is perhaps the worst Christmas commercial in festive commercial history. 9 to 11 p.m. Don't miss it.
Well, that sounds extremely exciting. And what good news coming from Donald Trump that the Chagos Islands are going to remain British. God save the King. That's all coming up after the weather. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I am, amazingly enough, still Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation. And I know you're dying to hear the weather report from Somerset. Well, you may be surprised to know that the conditions in Somerset are set to continue fair. There may be precipitation overnight to keep the crops growing, but otherwise the sun will be shining beautifully even in November.
Even though we'll see a cloudy start, it'll be a bright outlook for the rest of the day. Boxed Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Evening. Thanks for joining me for your latest weather update from the Met Office here on GB News. A lot of cloud around tomorrow. For many, it'll be a duller day compared to today. But again, for most places, not going to be much rain around. It has been a very dry start to November, thanks to high pressure by and large. Changes are on the way, particularly as we go towards the weekend. There is a weather front just slowly working south, but it's kind of fizzling out, bumping up against that high pressure. Will still bring some rain and drizzle, just trickling its way south across parts of central and eastern England through the night, eventually turning things a bit damp across the southeast. Ahead of it, temperatures could dip down to single figures, but behind it with a lot more cloud, generally a milder night than last night. Could again be some mist and fog patches forming through parts of southern Scotland where we do get the clearer spells, and it will be a damp and potentially drizzly start to the day across southernmost counties of England, so a very different feel here compared to today. Elsewhere, most places just dry and cloudy, but there will be some holes in the cloud here and there. Thick cloud, though, for northern Scotland means a dull and damp and at times drizzly morning for the Highlands and the Western Isles. Let's go through the rest of the day. Not a great deal will change. I'm hopeful the rain and drizzle in the far south should scoot away, and also that skies will brighten over central and eastern England in particular. Decent chance of seeing some sunny spells coming through. Parts of southern and eastern Scotland may also brighten up, but for many it will just stay pretty drab. Where it does, 10 or 11 the top temperature, bit of brightness, could see those temperatures getting up into the teens, and again the wind's fairly light for most places. Friday we'll start to see a change, but again for most it'll be dry. Some light rain and drizzle over northern England, North Wales, turning wetter in the far northwest and windier here as well. This is an active weather front that's going to bring a change, getting gusty and turning soggy. Further south, generally dry with some sunshine, 10 or 11 degrees Celsius, but it's going to turn colder for all of us through the weekend.
There will be a light breeze in the morning, leading to a warm front. Boxed heat pumps, sponsors of weather on GB News.
There's only 2 weeks remaining to win Christmas on Us this year. There's £20,025 in tax-free cash. There's £5,000 to spend on gifts for all the family. There's £500 to spend in your favourite supermarket. And a festively themed GB News goodie bag. We'll get it all to you in time for the big day. For another chance to win, call 0903 681 3232. Calls cost £2 plus your network access charge. Text cash to 63232. One entry costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. Or text bonus to 63232. 5 entries cost £5 plus one standard network rate message. You can enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries start from just £2 or post your name and number to GB09 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 6 p.m. on the 22nd of November. Please check the closing time if listening